Hello there, Vector Podcast, Season 2. We are relaunching after summer, and there was a little bit of break. Last episode was from Berlin Buzzwords. And today, coincidentally, we have a guest from Berlin, Malte Pietsch, CTO of Deepset, the company behind Haystack. So we're going to be diving into what I call a neural framework, but I wonder if Malte would like give a different picture there, but still very interested to learn and dive into multiple topics there. Hey, Malte, how are you doing?
I'm good, doing great. Thanks for having me today. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm great. It's still summer. It's like super hot, and as we were exchanging before the recording, it's like super hot. But I like it. So yeah, I think before we dive into what is Haystack, I really like to learn about yourself and what is your background, and how did you kind of find yourself in this space of what we call vector search. I wonder if you describe it differently, but I call it vector search players. So can you tell a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that. So yeah, I would say my background is mostly in NLP engineering, what you would call probably these days. And during my studies, I basically had no clue about NLP. I think it wasn't really any part of our coursework or wasn't really a thing. And it all for me all then started basically after my studies when I did like a research project in the US, which was at the intersection of machine learning and healthcare. And the big focus there was on numerical data. So we were basically trying to find signals, patterns in laboratory measurements for kidney disease patients to predict some kind of risks. And that was all kind of numerical data. NLP wasn't really scope of that project, but there was for me then basically one kind of event that made me then get in touch with NLP and eventually fall in love. And it was really in this project we tried to predict a lot of these risk factors, doing a lot of, I would say, quite fancy modeling to get some good signals. And at the end, it kind of worked. We were able to predict some risk, but when we then talked to doctors and showed them these results or asked for their feedback, they said, yeah, that's all correct, yeah, but it's not really new. Like we knew that before. But this part here, this is an interesting one, and this is what did you do there? And that was basically the only small part where we looked at written notes of doctors during treatments. And from a modeling perspective, that was really, I would say, nothing fancy, nothing advanced, nothing where we spend a lot of time. But at the end, it was the point, I think, where the doctors, the physicians saw the biggest value. And that kind of got me then thinking, and I thought, okay, wow, like just this kind of data source, it was something they couldn't really access before. And now with this like very simple native method, they somehow saw a value, a new thing. And that's basically where I thought, oh, wow, that's cool. What can you actually then do with more advanced methods if you have more fancy models? How can you make this kind of unused data source then accessible? Basically realizing the power of it. And that's basically when I then started digging deeper, working more on NLP. At some point then said, left research because I was really interested in seeing these models working in the real world. How do they work at scale? How can they really then solve problems every day? Basically I came back to Germany, worked in a couple of startups, always at this say NLP at scale kind of intersection, a lot in online advertisement, recommender systems, and then eventually, I think 4 years ago, then we started Deepset, and together with 2 colleagues, we founded Deepset, basically because we saw this big motion NLP. It was kind of piling up. That was all like still pre-transformers, but there were early signs, I think, on research that things are becoming more feasible and super interesting things became possible. at the same time, we also saw that there's this big gap, like things becoming possible on research side didn't really mean people were using it in production in the industry. And I think we were at this interesting bubble back then where we did it, where we applied deep learning models at scale, saw how that worked, but also saw how much of work it actually is, of manual work to get it done. And basically the early days of Deepset were mainly around how can we bridge that gap? How can we get latest models from research into production in the industry? What kind of product tooling can we build to make that transition easier? Yeah, and that's basically how we ended up in the startup world, building out Deepset. Initially, as I said, it was really more about, we saw this problem. We had a couple of, let's say, product hypotheses, but we didn't let's say place a bet on directly on one of them. We rather said, okay, let's go out there. Let's really try to understand for 1 year what are really repetitive use cases out there. What are really the pain points of other enterprise teams that are working in that field, and then kind of settling on a product and then building it out. Yeah, and that's basically after 1 year how we ended up in search, because that was I would say really the one use case, the dominant use case that was present in every company that we worked with, and that was really a big, say, valuable use case, where the push not only came from the developers who wanted to do something better, but also actually from the business side, where people saw big value and said, hey, I use Google every day. Why can't we have something similar in our product or in our internal data sets? And that I think was something that got us then really interested. And at the same time, then on the tech side, basically learning more and more about the pain points. Why is it actually so difficult for people in these enterprises to build modern search systems? What could you actually do to help them?
Yeah, that's fascinating. Actually, 4 or 5 years ago, could you have imagined that NLP would cross paths with search? Because like in many ways, the sparse search, which existed for many years before, was in some sense, I sensed it that way in mailing list, let's say Apache Solar mailing list. People were dreaming about applying NLP in some way compared to what is happening right now. I don't want to downplay those efforts, but I'm saying things like you could embed a post tag, part of speech tag on term level, and then use that during search. Again, you need to run some kind of parser on the query, and then use that payload information to filter through, let's say, adjectives and verbs or something like that. I don't know if there was any practical application in place. Probably there was. But again, if you compare that to what is happening today, you basically have a vast array of models, right? Deep learning models that can be applied directly to search using vector search approach. Could you have imagined this happening when you were about to start the company?
No, I would say I was. I think what we had big say dreams about NLP, and we were true believers that that things become easier and say more feasible in production. But that was more actually on the, I would say, transfer learning side, and making models, let's say, more easily adoptable to certain domains. For search, I think that was for us only then on our journey where we kind of realized, oh, like that's actually two interesting different fields kind of connecting over time, right? And also I felt from, at least from our perspective, from a community side, from the people who worked on information retrieval, there was, I think, for a long time a big there were like a lot of skeptic people when we talked about NLP or dense retrieval, for a good reason, right? Because I think there was also like a lot of hype around deep learning, and still I would say a lot of promises that were made, like that it will just outperform sparse retrieval out of the box. And then I think many of these promises were not held for a long time. Yeah, but I think then basically there was another phase where I think people realized, oh, actually now it's kind of starting to work, and oh, not only just in research and these ivory towers and lab settings, but actually also in reality at scale. And I think that was then for us also the moment where it got really interesting. And I think since then, just crazy to see how things are progressing. When we think about a multimodal search, or yeah, just also like more, I say, going away from document retrieval to maybe something like question answering, which we do a lot. Yeah, it's really crazy to see what's possible these days, and I couldn't have imagined that it's going so fast.
Yeah, and there are a lot of contributors as well, of course. I just happened to give a talk about players in vector search. I will link it in the show notes, which was just published with C's London IR meetup. But even that, during that presentation, I felt like I'm scratching the tip of the iceberg in some sense. I know there is so much happening. And in Haystack, like, did you have a vision for like you said, you didn't know what the product will be, but you knew sort of the repetitive use cases in a way, right? And also challenges. Can you share some of the early day challenges that you saw, and do you think that they are solved today, or are they still kind of like in the mix of we need to fix some things there?
So I think that was basically like all about this first year of Deepset, where we did these learnings, where it wasn't that clear. But after that year, I think we had a lot of I think clear insights, and at least for us a clear vision also for Haystack, what we wanna solve there. And I would say the big challenge, the big problem that we focused on, that we saw in the industry, was having just all these scattered technologies. And basically Haystack is trying, or as I would say, as a design philosophy and design principle, has two things in place that try to bring these scattered technologies together in a meaningful way. And what I mean with that is basically, if you think about search, it's, I would say, really, it's a lot more than model, right? And typically you have vector databases. You maybe chain together multiple models. You have some things you want to do at indexing time. You have other things you want to do at query time. And for each of these, say, kind of components that you need at the end, there are so many different options that you can plug in, and often it's hard to say in the early days, I don't know, do I go for Elasticsearch or something like Pinecone, a vector database? Do I go for this model or that model? Do I need just a retriever in my pipeline, or do I actually also need to add a re-ranker or something else? And we just saw that teams were basically spending a lot of time on gluing these things together manually. And even when they had it once, there was some constant, maintenance work or iterations where they had to exchange one component of their system. And that was really just slowing them down a lot, and sometimes even then causing that a project got stale over time, not really ending up in production, but kind of dying in the prototyping stage because it just took so long, and things got kind of sidetracked. And with Haystack, we basically tried to solve that with having very clear building blocks, like for example, a retriever, which is a very clear interface, and within that you can swap a lot of different technologies, models, and the same for basically vector database or document stores, where you can very easily change between something like Elasticsearch, Pinecone, Weaviate, and whatnot. So I would say was the one thing, these building blocks, and trying to get the focus of developers back on making these, say, creative decisions, what they actually want to have in their pipeline, trying it out with end users, rather than just spending time on gluing things together. And the second thing is I would say a very deep concept also in Haystack are pipelines. So really what we saw is it's not just one model. It's typically a couple of steps that you want to have there. So in Haystack, we started early on having direct acyclic graphs where you can have different nodes. And basically when you have a query or an indexing time file that kind of hits the pipeline, you kind of route it through this graph. And that can be very easy. Where you say I have a query, I do put it to a retriever and I get back my documents. Or it can go basically quite complex where you say, oh, like depending on the query type, I don't know, if it's a keyword query, I routed a certain path in my graph, in my pipeline, or if it's say a question, maybe I go a different way and I have different models basically involved in my search request. And yeah, these two, I would say, are the core principles in Haystack.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So that second thing, the acyclic graph would allow for very complex scenarios, right? Like as you explained, we could in principle support question answering use case side by side with kind of like normal search with few re-rankers and stuff, right? Is that correct?
Exactly. So, and that's what we basically learned from customers. Like when we saw there was a big interest in something like question answering, and people say, "Wow, like that's amazing. Can we use that for our website or for our product here?" But doing that switch in a production case is quite tough, right? Like if people are used to do keyword queries and they know I have to enter here keywords to get basically my results, and then from one day to the other you switch to more semantic queries, maybe more to questions, or also I think in dense retrieval if you really have more sentences that you use. It takes some time for people to adjust, and we saw that in a couple of scenarios that basically the traffic kind of requests that come in start a lot with keyword queries and then over time slowly shift towards more semantic queries. When people realize, oh, I can actually also ask a question, and oh, it's like a bit like Google. Then there is this trend, but you need, I think, to have an option in your system to allow both for a certain time. And in Haystack, basically, we do it then with a query classifier where you can initially basically classify, is that a question or a keyword query, or you could go do it also semantically, like say on a topic level, saying, oh, like this is a query for a certain type of category in my document set, and then maybe do something different.
And like early on, Haystack, did it integrate with any database per se? Was it like Elasticsearch back then?
Yeah, like the basically starting point was Elasticsearch. It was the very first document store we had. No.
But Elasticsearch back then I believe, didn't support neural search, right? So how did you actually gel these things together?
Yeah, that was just like kind of coming then over time, right? So it was, I think, the era where like Elasticsearch was for us was really, we came from a question answering use cases a lot, and there was really like, how do we scale that? Like, how can we now ask questions not on a single document and a single small passage, but how can we do it actually on millions of files? And BM25, like as a retriever, as a step before that, was okay, was not too bad, and that's kind of how it started, and then very fast evolved into say vector search direction, where we had then FAIS basically as a next document store, in combination with some SQL database for all the metadata and so on, and then it basically kind of I think took off on the vector database side with Milvus, Weaviate, Pinecone, and so on and so forth. OpenSearch today is also part of Haystack, but that was, I think, then just probably like a half year after we launched Haystack.
Oh yeah, that's awesome. That sounds quite quick. I know that Weaviate was also emerging about the same time. And then Milbus, I guess, as well. Yeah, that sounds super cool. And was there as you were approaching your clients or like prospects, was there any specific use case that you would be demoing with because you knew this would trigger the aha moment, like question answering, or maybe a specific domain where you did that?
Yeah, I would say we were, like, for us, it was a lot around question answering back then. That was really where we created, I think, many of these aha moments. I still remember when we were at one client, and we were in this meeting, and it was like in the financial domain. So we're interested in kind of asking questions on financial reports of certain companies and basically accelerating their analysis. And at one point in this meeting, we showed what you can do with question answering, asking these questions, and they also like suggested own questions that we should ask, and they worked. So they were at that point then convinced, oh, like that's not fake, it's not a smoke and mirror here. Basically the boss of that department was standing up and shouting like, wow, that's amazing, and went out of the office, entered the office next door, and carried over colleagues and said like, oh, you have to see that. And that was actually even before we started building Haystack, but for us, these kind of moments were very important to see, hey, like this is something that is not just fascinating for techies like we were, but also, say, business people, end users see that value and see value in their work for it.
Yeah, I can imagine that, and it's like a class of what we call knowledge workers, right? It's something that you spend so much time on crafting these queries, and I've spent some time in the full text finance, I would say, at AlphaSense, and I remember some of the clients, they had accumulated Boolean queries over a period of 20 years, right? And they were like so long, it's like several pages. When you slap that into Solr, it runs for 3 minutes because our index layout was not what it is today and was not very optimal.
Yeah, it's crazy to see what people kind of start doing as workarounds, right? So we had a similar case with an airplane manufacturer. So it was not financial domain, but really on, say, more maintenance level, analyzing basically issues that come up maybe in certain technical areas. And they also had like these crazy Boolean search queries, and people just became experts in crafting that. But it took them really long, like just asking, sending one query, creating this query was taking easily like minutes.
Yeah, exactly. And so what Haystack is today, can you elaborate a bit on the architecture, and maybe if it's possible, if you find it easy, if you pick, let's say, use case. Actually, I was talking to one stakeholder who wanted to build a chatbot, but it was a very specific domain. So that chatbot would actually ask you some kind of philosophical Zen-like questions, sort of a little bit like distracting you from what's going on. Let's say you are on a conference and a lot of things go through your mind, but you don't register maybe what's going on. You don't yet see the value, and that Zenbot might kind of ask you and, well, essentially allow you to pause and reflect, right? But what I've realized is that, yeah, I could pick an off-the-shelf model, let's say question answering BERT or something, but it probably wouldn't work on what I want, right? My domain is different, and I had an electronic book with this Zen type of statements. So I guess one question I'm hinting to is kind of fine tuning, or maybe even like retraining, right? But where would I start with Haystack, and can you walk me through the architecture?
Sure. So yeah, as mentioned earlier, I think the core principles are these building blocks, and using these building blocks to assemble pipelines. And I would say the core where we come from is question answering and search. But by now, I would say the framework has evolved a lot in that direction. If you have a lot of different nodes and can support a lot of different use cases going to translation, zero-shot classification, and you could use these nodes in isolation, or you can kind of assemble them and use them within your search pipeline. So usually, I think what our users do and how they start is yeah, they often come with a kind of search use case, pick one of the standard pipelines that we have, so you can very easily, with a few lines of Python, create a pipeline for, let's say, question answering or maybe dense retrieval. You pick a document store, you pick one model from, for example, the Hugging Face model hub, and we give some recommendations on which models might be a good starting point. And then it's very easy actually to just put your files into your pipeline. It can be PDF files. We do the conversion basically for you. There's a node for it, and just have a basic, say, demo system up and running in a few minutes. And that's often already, I think, a good starting point if you are maybe also new to that field, if you just want to try it quickly out on, I know, this kind of ebooks that you mentioned, and get a first, let's say, qualitative understanding how good are these off-the-shelf pipelines for my use case. Get this first data point, and then basically enter the, I would say, next steps typically in your project. If you see, oh, like this is promising but not enough for really going to production, then typically you go more in this experimentation mode where you say, oh, let's now maybe evaluate, compare a couple of different models. Let's maybe adjust this pipeline a bit to I don't know, add a re-ranker maybe, or go maybe to a hybrid retrieval pipeline where we can basically have a BM25 retriever in parallel to a dense retriever, and we join these documents. And Haystack has a lot of functionality that makes that easy to basically change your pipeline as you want it very quickly, and then evaluate if that gives you any benefit. If these, say, off-the-shelf options and combinations are not enough for a use case, then yeah, you can go down the fine-tuning route, I would say. We have also open source a notation tool, a labeling tool where you can create training data, and basically can fine-tune parts of your pipeline, retriever or reader, for question answering. So basically, I would say everything from a quick prototype to, okay, let's do some experiments here and there, to then going in production and deploying it with a basic REST API on top, basically.
Yeah, sounds cool. And so in that experimentation mode, I guess one aspect is like fine tuning, you mentioned, right? The other is kind of like what building blocks I could plug in, right? And I know you guys have really good documentation. Is there something like a tutorial or some kind of walkthrough that would even help me discover as a user what are the options?
So we have a couple of different tutorials showing you what kind of nodes also you can use. Like, many people are not aware of, for example, options that you can do at indexing time that might be helpful. So to give you an example, like enriching your documents with metadata can be incredibly powerful later at search time, because you can then filter down your search space to maybe more categories that you're interested in. And there we have, for example, tutorials that show you how easily you can, for example, classify documents that you index into certain categories, and then later on at query time, use these categories to narrow down your search space, filter for these categories. On the model side, say if you are now, you know that you want to have a say QA model, a reader, and you're now interested in what model you want, I would probably suggest users to go to our benchmarks page, which is linked from documentation. There we have a couple of comparisons in terms of accuracy and speed. But also we have most of our own models on the Hugging Face model hub, where typically you find this information in the model cards.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you guys, in addition to open source version that I presume could host completely myself, right? I
Yeah.
still have a bunch of questions on that open source side, but still, you also offer the cloud version. You call it Deepset Cloud, is that right? Can you explain what users get with that? I presume scalability, but maybe something else. And I think we can leave a link to in the show notes as well for those users who want to try it out.
Yeah, basically Haystack, the open source project, is really a Python framework. So you can do everything you want there, to do prototypes, do experiments, and if you want, also go to production with it. But we also found, basically in addition to that, people want something more. Like they want really a hosted platform where it's really end to end, and where basically you have faster workflows. So really, I would say covering the whole life cycle of an NLP application, from early prototyping to running many experiments in parallel, getting more guidance also from a UI perspective on what to launch, investigating certain documents in a faster way. Then to, okay, now I did all these experiments and I want to have a kind of one-click path to production, and I don't want to bother with any scaling and basically productionizing on my side. And this is basically what we do with Deepset Cloud. So I can imagine it as a hosted platform in the cloud, a SaaS platform, where you develop your NLP applications and can easily bring them to production and monitor them afterwards. So really I would say, whole life cycle, and especially if you would say on getting your NLP pipelines faster to production, as you would probably do it on a, say, just Python level, and then continue monitoring them and having this closed loop if you later want to maintain them.
Yeah, sounds cool. And since it's kind of like, so with open source version, I presume I could do kind of a local development on my PC, right? And then go and use some deployment pipeline to deploy it. With cloud version, I have sort of like a managed Haystack, right? And now thinking about developer experience, are you guys moving more towards cloud tools as well? You know, like for example, a code editor could be in the cloud, so I do changes and click the button and off it goes. I don't even need to download it locally, right? Or or do you see some other trend with your users?
No, like I mean, maybe that's also an important point. So it's still a developer platform, right? So we are not in a low code, no code space. And what we really try is basically giving developers the option to customize certain components, and that then usually goes through coding. And there we have, for example, editors directly on the platform, where you can edit, for example, just the YAML definition of pipelines and quickly switch certain parameters if you want to do that. And then it's basically, there's a hosted notebooks where you can also easily kind of open these resources like a pipeline, and we automatically create some Python code of it in a notebook that you can then kind of edit as you know it also from Haystack open source, adjust a certain component, debug it, maybe add another one, and then it's basically just one Python line again to move away from the Python code in your notebook to the, say, production artifacts, the pipeline that is then deployed and can run in production.
Yeah, sounds cool. And if a user has some, as a user, I mean, it could be a company, right? So let's say they have an established tool set, you know, maybe if they use SageMaker, maybe they don't, maybe they use something else. How do you breach this tool set that is kind of outside of Haystack? Do you have to?
I would say in most cases not. I mean, where we basically stop, I would say, with Deepset Cloud is when you have your pipeline, your NLP service, and you have your REST API that you expose. That's kind of where we stop. So there's like a lot of, I would say, stuff in a company that is built around it, when you integrate it into your product, and also on the other, say, early side of where do the files come from, where does data come from, how do you sync it into Deepset Cloud. But within that space, we rather see people, customers, who appreciate that it's like fully integrated, and they don't usually then want to stay on SageMaker if they are on it for these NLP use cases. So from our perspective, yeah, there are, I would say, these more generic solutions that are not specific for NLP. They can work for any kind of machine learning. But if you really have cases where you want to be faster on your NLP use cases, want to have more, say, support on that side, that's basically where Deepset Cloud then comes into play. And to give you an example, if you think of experiments, if you evaluate these pipelines, do give basically there are a lot of options to investigate predictions and what do these metrics actually say. And this, I think, is something that is usually missing in solutions like SageMaker. You have to then really combine it with many other tools and build even there like a lot of extra stuff, and that basically comes all together already with Deepset Cloud.
Yeah. So do I get it right? So Deepset Cloud would offer me sort of an evaluation tool set, right? Can I get the same in the open source version, or it's not present there?
You can basically evaluate single pipelines also in the open source version. The difference is that basically in Deepset Cloud, you have a full overview over your project where you can really track all your experiments. You can kind of compare them. You can launch easily 20 experiments in parallel. And this, especially on large data sets, is done with open source, I think, and generally, you would need to provision a lot of machines, GPUs to run that in parallel. And that's basically what one thing that we offer in Deepset Cloud. And the other is basically I would say, just the UI layer over it. So of course I can work with Haystack on and get basically a report around my experiments. I get maybe a pandas data frame. I get some metrics. What we do basically on top in Deepset Cloud is allowing people to interact with this kind of data more easily, like finding examples of queries that failed, that or that are successful, getting feedback from also end users, so collaborating basically with the persons who use that search system at the end. And now that's also what I think what we saw a lot, that yeah, you can extract your predictions, and maybe it's like a CSV, and then you share it with your next colleague, who then kind of rates or give say human evaluation if these queries make sense or not. But again, this is like a lot of friction. You have then a lot of these CSVs or Excel files floating around. And what we do is, I think, bring this together again, having it in one place, so that you can also in future easily reuse that for other experiments, even use it for training, and have it basically in one central place.
Yeah, sounds amazing. From what I gather, this sounds like an end-to-end MLOps platform specifically for NLP neural search, right? Because
exactly.
you have thought through so many things, not only the developer side of things like experimentation, but also debugging and actually going through the feedback from stakeholders or users, and then communicating with them.
Yeah, and I think this is like something that is missed in many projects, right? This like end user collaboration, and from our experience, this should really happen in a very early stage of a project, but also then kind of continuously when you move to production, and even when you are in production. But I think like this is something which is, if you don't have the right tooling, it's just very annoying to, I don't know, you probably like just building a demo, like a UI for some search system. If you are not a front-end developer, if you're an NLP engineer, it takes some extra time, and even with something like Streamlit these days, it's still is then annoying to do it properly. And if you're in an enterprise, maybe to have some access rules, permission rules. But it's so important, I think, when we look at what projects work out at the end, what pipelines from our customers go to production. It's really a big criteria, I think, in the early days, like sharing a demo with your colleagues and end users. So really the first pipeline you have, more or less giving it to the hands of users and seeing what they think about it and how they use it. And there were so many examples where NLP engineers thought they knew what people were searching, but after these kind of demo sessions or sharing a demo and seeing what people actually do there, then they realized, oh, like they use a lot of keyword queries, or they never put a question mark at the end, or they have a lot of misspellings, or what else. So I think there's a lot of early learnings that you can make as a developer from these demos and just handing it out. And also I think on the other side, just creating this early aha moment, this kind of wow effect, and some trust on the end user side is also crucial. So I would say this is like the one point, very early demo, getting this initial feedback. And then probably the second point that we see often is when you then had a time of running your experiments, tuning your pipeline, kind of the way to production, having then at some point a second phase where you just do again some, say, manual evaluation with end users. So not completely relying on machine learning metrics, because we think there's some kind of metric blindness in the industry sometimes. You just kind of get obsessed with your one metric that you optimize in these experiments, and whatever it is, just increasing it from experiment to experiment. And then you go to production and you realize, wow, okay, this metric is doesn't say anything about the user satisfaction that I have in the end. And yeah, there are so many, I think, examples from our customers where just handing out this pipeline, showing kind of like what search queries and results, and then collecting some easy kind of thumbs up, thumbs down feedback, and then trying to correlate, is that really what we also saw in our experiments and our metrics, and then I think in many cases it was that either the pipeline was not yet ready for production, and they realized, oh, like it's far less accurate than we thought, or also cases where it was the other way around, where teams thought, oh, like we are stuck, we will never go beyond, I don't know, like for QA F1 score of 60%. We are doomed here. It's not working. And then they kind of handed out these predictions, or like gave this demo, and then people actually thought, like, no, it's like these predictions are perfectly fine. And when you then dig deeper, I think it's often that engineers not look enough into the data, I think, and just kind of rely on this high-level metric. And I think especially nowadays, these metrics only tell really, I think, a part of the story, because again, like for question answering or also for search, if you have a evaluation data set, and let's say you always label the exact answer for a certain question or query, there's just so many ways how can give a correct answer for a question that is different to this label. So to give you an example, we have many customers for financial domain. So a typical question there is, how will revenue evolve next year? And maybe in your data set, in your evaluation data set, you labeled it will increase by 12%. And now at say prediction time, your model maybe finds another passage or generates the answer and says it will significantly increase. And so like there's no overlap at all from a lexical side still both answers make sense and are correct, and we can probably debate now which one is more accurate. But in many cases, they basically give the same answer semantically, but they're just formulated very differently, and that's where I would say traditional metrics fail. So yeah, I think we need better metrics, and we basically did some research work on that, and it's also part of Haystack, where you can do like more semantic answer similarity as a metric. But it's of course also just, I think, looking at your data and looking at these predictions and seeing if they're really wrong or if they're actually okay, and maybe it's a problem of metrics or your labeling process, where maybe you need to collect more different options that are okay.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's like it's a challenge of intersecting user language with whatever machinery you have to answer that, right? Be it sparse search, be it dense search, doesn't matter. Like, users don't care. What they care is that their language is understood, and often enough it's not. Especially around things like BERT. If we go dense, BERT model doesn't understand negations, right? There was a research paper on that, and that might actually harm. There was even a Google example where it's showing the opposite. Like you say, I don't want that, but they say, yes, you actually do. And then take that medicine, which might be harmful. And then the metrics is essentially what I gather from what you just described. Essentially, you might have offline metrics, right? Let's say NDCG or precision or recall, whatever. And then you have online metrics, right? And actually crafting the online metrics is also an art, and it's never ending journey. And just recently, I came across one blog post which was shared by a former Netflix engineer. I will make sure to link it in the show notes as well, describing click residual metric, right? So it's what is your expected success on that, let's say, segment of your market, whatever, on the queries, versus what you got. And then people still keep trying and trying and trying, but it just doesn't deliver. So you could have this as a low-hanging fruit to fix your system, right? And so do you see that maybe that's already happening in Haystack, or do you see that might happen, that I, as a user, might be able to describe my metric, let's say, in the form of Python or JavaScript code or whatever, plug it into Haystack and let it measure what I want and kind of mimic the online metric in some sense?
You mean like providing kind of custom metrics?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you can do that to some degree already, like plugging in basically like a Python function and forwarding it. That's the one way. I think the other is probably on a node level. So as you can imagine, these pipelines, they're providing at some point predictions, be it answers or documents. So you can also easily kind of add custom nodes where you say, okay, like this node should now, I don't know, compare it to whatever you want, or like maybe on an online setting, kind of write some logs somewhere, like, I don't know, take some signals from the early query to, I don't know, an external system where you can monitor it. So yeah, I think that's probably one of the kind of next steps where we see it's more and more online metrics, more and more online experiments. I would say right now, where we see big parts of the market, I think they're still more in that phase of developing, experimenting, finding the pipeline, getting it initially to production, and having there really, I would say, a smooth journey, and having a fast path to production, kind of high success rates for these projects. I would say this is where we right now focus on more. But yeah, I would say further down the road, if you really think about the whole MLOps life cycle, I think on the monitoring side, there's a lot you can do on online metrics, but also then things like data drift. Do my queries actually shift into a different direction? Do these think a lot about query profiles? I think, okay, like, what are actually these this use case, how can we describe the query distribution? And this can be on a formal level, like say again, questions versus keyword queries, but could be also on a topic level to really understand, okay, this is a profile at point A, and maybe we can match it with certain pipelines, but also is that kind of changing over time?
Yeah, yeah. You somewhat anticipate, expected my question, or sort of partly answered my question, my next question about where do you see the biggest effort in Haystack and Deepset Cloud going, let's say, beyond MLOps, tightening the knobs and making sure that this flies and works correctly. More towards, I know you guys are also hiring a product manager, so sort of like more on vision side. And connected to that, if you will, what do you think is missing on the market today still? Maybe in understanding, maybe in perception level, maybe in tooling. You already alluded also to things like metric blindness, right? And maybe when users get stuck in thinking that this is a wrong system, but actually it's not, they just didn't look the right way and things like that.
Yeah. There's, I think, a ton of work still left. I think we already talked about it. I think things progressed a lot in the last year, so it's crazy to see. But still, I feel we're still in the middle of it, or just starting, and there's so much more work and things you can improve and do better. Yeah, I would say for us right now, there's like a lot of different directions. But I think especially on the open source side, we definitely want to improve the developer experience. Also, like simplifying the first steps within Haystack. I think it can be still overwhelming, and we really want to make sure that get as many people to this first aha moment, like using it on your own data, asking a few questions, comparing sparse to dense retrieval, and really experiencing this firsthand. I think this is one of the things we work on. Then a lot around multimodal. So we recently added support for tables within Haystack. So that's, I think, one interesting direction right now, that you can really query into these kind of tables in your documents, but maybe also further down the road into your SQL database as another data source. And then, of course, everything around images, videos, audio. It's also interesting for us. I think for our customers, it's typically less important than kind of text and tables, but still, I think it's interesting option that you can do there. So yeah, I think that's like a lot on open source side. On Deepset Cloud, yeah, we recently launched basically the experiments module. That was, I think, one big step forward there. And now it's a lot around giving there also guidance and suggestions. Like, to give an example, now I have I ran an experiment. I have like a lot of these metrics. I have a lot of data that was somehow generated. But as it's not a single model anymore, it's like a pipeline. I really want to understand as a data scientist, okay, like where should I now focus on, or like what's probably a good way forward to improve this pipeline? Is it rather the retriever problem? Is it rather another node that I should improve? Is maybe something wrong with my evaluation data set? Should I go back to labeling? And like giving these kind of, or at least making this kind of analysis easier, is something that we work on right now. And then I think further down the road, it will be for us a lot expanding in this whole MLOps lifecycle. So we talk about like monitoring, but also making it simpler to integrate it at both ends. So and basically on the one side, ingesting your source data more easily and syncing it more easily into Deepset Cloud, so that you can say, I don't know, maybe I have a wiki system that I use. Maybe, I don't know, I use Notion, or maybe I use Confluence, or I have another Elasticsearch cluster where I have already my documents that I'm interested in. So really having there kind of smooth connectors that you can import your data and directly work on it. And then on the other end, you have your API. Now, how can I easily get now a kind of search bar or search functionality in my final product? So yeah, there's a lot of things. And then everything around fine-tuning, few shot learning with large language models. That's something we are quite excited about. Because as you mentioned, I think right now we already, I think, made a big step forward that there are a lot of use cases where you don't need to train at all anymore. And then maybe that's a misperception that we also see in the market. I think the typical users come to us and say like, oh yeah, I have this use case, how can I train? And then we usually ask, do you really need to train your own model? Like, have you tried this and that, like these kind of combinations and kind of models that are out there, like certain sentence transformers, certain pre-trained QA models or ranker models. And I said like, no, but like our use case is so different, and that won't work. And in many cases it does, or at least they're surprised how good it is already, and maybe it's enough to get started on it. So I think, yeah, that's one misperception. Still, I think there are then also these cases, to be fair, where fine-tuning still helps, right? And where you really care about a few percentage points better accuracy, and where you then go down and say, oh, let's now start labeling, let's collect either like really in this manual labeling process, or maybe from some more noisy, maybe real time, or like production data where you saw what people searched, what they clicked. How can we use that maybe for training? So that's something where we see big potential probably for next year. And basically want to simplify this domain adaptation to have less manual effort and basically more automated way of training it, and yeah, that I think was also a lot in the direction of maybe large language models.
Yeah, sounds cool. And if we go in even and look even further into the future, let's say, I don't know, 5-10 years out, do you think that Haystack at some point may even start suggesting the user what to try? You know, if you go and set up a KPI for yourself, right, your end goal, and then through the chain in that acyclic graph, it looks like finds a weak node and says, yeah, something is going on there. Then it would actually suggest you also to try some other model. Do you think it's possible, or do you think it's a wrong direction at all? Like, you'd rather leave this to the creativity of your users?
I think it's a combination of both. So I definitely think that helps to accelerate in certain parts of your work. So especially I think suggesting what experiment to run next, or what it could be something you can try. So I'm a big fan of that, and I think we don't need to go probably like 5 or 10 years down the road. I think this is happening already sooner. So like in Haystack and Deepset Cloud. Yeah, maybe just like one thing so we have at our company something that we call Hacky Friday. So it's like one Friday every month where every person in the company can work on whatever they want. So really hacking on crazy ideas, trying stuff out. And I know that this Friday, people are working on a generative model where you basically you describe what you want, like what kind of pipeline. So you can type in, let's say, I want a document search pipeline that works on legal data that is very fast, something like that. And the output is basically a YAML file that describes this Haystack pipeline, which you can then easily kind of load in Python, try out, and also load in Deepset Cloud and run it there. So that's something we are experimenting with right now. And of course, some time further down the road, I could see that you can take also like signals from what we know from what worked on certain domains, and basically fuse that into this maybe generative process.
Yeah, it sounds cool. Actually, it reminded me of the time when I was doing my PhD, something like 12 years ago, or even a bit more. I had a collaborator who wrote a paper on taking the user text and converting that into C++ code. And the use case, I don't remember exactly all the details of the use case, but I remember it was somewhere in the airport. So like they do a lot of this routine work. And instead of repeating it, you could actually build a smarter system, right? So you think this could be the future of Haystack or maybe the industry at large?
Yeah, at least I think it's like definitely one element that helps accelerating, right? So if you look at Copilot right now, I like it a lot for coding, and I'm still in many cases surprised what Copilot suggests you as on a code level. And I think something similar is also possible on the machine learning side. That you not only generate like correct code, but really something that fits for a use case, like you describe it. I mean, I think it's like if you think about the bigger picture, I think it's one piece that helps you in your workflow. I think there's still like many other pieces that we need to get right, and that won't be, let's say, the holy grail. I think at the end, what I really believe in is that you need a framework or a platform, however you want to call it, where you can easily compare things on your data, and I think this helps a lot then in creating transparency in the market, creating also like kind of trust for your own use case, that you're not basically doing a technology choice before you actually started working on your use case. And that I think holds for vector databases, where maybe today this is a good choice for you, but maybe, I don't know, 1 year down the road, maybe you want to switch. I think this market is so early that it's very hard to place a bet right now on one of these technologies. And similarly, I think this is on the modeling side. There's like so much crazy buzz around large language models, and I can personally really see the trend going there. But it's also, I think, very important to understand if that's really useful for your use case now, how it compares to much smaller models, and yeah, this should be easy, right? This shouldn't be a big part of your project. It should be rather you trying to think about options you want to try, maybe getting some suggestions as well there. But this should be, I think, this say human creativity part as well, and then the actual say swapping of components and comparing them, making them comparable. I think that's nothing where you should spend time as a developer on.
Yeah, and like connected to the question about future, maybe in closing off on that, we recently built with my colleague Arne Talman a multimodal and multilingual search demo, right? Where we used Clip model off the shelf without any fine tuning on web data. And it showed us really, really amazing results, right? So like where keyword search cannot find because simply metadata doesn't have it. And it's multilingual, right? So, and you type it the same query with neural retrieval and it gets it. Is there anything stopping Haystack to move into that direction as well? Sort of like crossing the boundary of only text, right? So like you did say multimodal in the context of, let's say, querying a table, but I could also query an image. Do you think that Haystack is going in that direction as well?
Yeah, so we are actively we are right now working on it. So we have a first kind of case where we want to support where you have a text query, but you can query also into images. So on the result side, and then basically, the other way around would be probably one of the later ones where you have an image as a query and you want to find different media types, let's say. But yeah, this is like definitely what we're right now working on. There, I think also like you need to always see what are then the big use cases and what kind of customers do you have, and how do they use it. I think with images, there's a lot of interesting use cases mainly in e-commerce. I would say that's cool. Yeah, that's definitely something we are already supporting to some degree, and will support more, I think, in the next months.
That's great to learn, and that also means that I need to adjust my classification, because I've been presenting what I know about the players in vector database and neural frameworks, and specifically for Haystack, I put NLP as the main vertical, and I think largely you guys still advertise that as the main vertical, but I think nothing stops you from switching that to multimodality, right? So NLP, computer vision, and maybe even speech at some point.
Yeah, totally. I think our approach is there is just a bit like say doing one thing to a quite a depth first and then moving on to the next, rather than, let's say, starting with very high level basic support for all modalities and then kind of growing all of them. So yeah, what we rather did in the past and still doing is very deep support for texts and yeah, really having there everything in place before kind of moving on to the next. That's a bit, I would say, a philosophical question, maybe, or strategic questions, how you want to do it.
Of course. So this field, Malte, is changing quite a lot, right? So a lot of things, generative models, really big, large models, models that I don't know even how to use yet, like DALL-E. Of course, beyond just kind of experimental interest, but probably there will be some use cases. Where do you think else the trends are going in this space?
Yeah, so I mean, like one big trend I think for sure is these large language models and everything around it. And as I mean, we talked earlier about it. The question is like, where is it right now? And is it already today really usable? Is it already kind of worth investigating them, comparing them for your own use cases? And I think there we are, I would say, still in an early phase. It's look at, for example, GPT-3 and I think Niels Reimers did a quite nice analysis earlier this year where he compared embeddings from GPT-3 to more standard size transformers. And there I think we saw that the performance is not bad, but it's also definitely not outperforming you say regular size models, which are 1,000 times smaller, cost a few dollars and not thousands and tens of thousands of dollars for inference costs. So I think there it's basically right now still, let's see case by case if it makes sense for a use case. But if you look a bit further into the next years, I'm pretty sure and convinced that this is only a matter of time until we see more and more large language models really in production, also in search pipelines in production. And I think that right now it's this phase of figuring out how can we make them really more efficient, also more reliable, so that we really can trust these results there. How can we in an easier way update to new knowledge? And what we right now look a lot into, and what I'm personally quite excited about is now this I think area of research around retrieval-based NLP. So yes, on the one hand side, kind of scaling up the models, making them bigger, because we I think learned over the last years that they are good few-shot learners, and that's of course exciting because you can just take these models and kind of throw a task at them and they will perform. So less manual work of annotating data, creating domain-specific data sets, and so on. But I think we also saw that they are not very efficient, and there are these other problems. How do you actually now teach GPT-3 about recent events or about your own domain knowledge? And typically, I think these data sets that you want to search in, they're not static, right? So they're constantly evolving, and do you really want to retrain these crazy models every few days or weeks just to kind of catch up with this? I think that's like where this stream of retrieval-based or retrieval-augmented models is super interesting. And I think there's a lot of cool work. I just this week read from Patrick Lewis this publication around the Atlas model. I'm not sure if you saw it, but there's basically the idea: can we somehow remove, let's say, the memory part from these big models and kind of outsource it to a database, to an index? And And then at query time, we still have like a large model. Yeah, that's like can do a lot of complex reasoning, but it's kind of basing the generation on some retrieved documents. And that can be useful for search, but can be also for fact checking or other use cases. Yeah, long story short, I think they did a lot of interesting experiments in that paper that show that you can actually outsource quite a bit of these parameters of this memory into a say a vector database, and still keep the few shot capabilities of these giant language models. And yeah, I think this is like a super cool route, like larger models, but still not putting everything in it, not blowing up parameter sizes unreasonably, but still combining it with let's say an external document base, knowledge base.
Yeah, I think it's the topic you touched upon. It's fascinating that on one hand, let's say you have a model, right? And if you keep retraining it or fine tuning it on latest data, you may run into this, I think it's called catastrophic forgetting, right? So like things that we as humans know, that, I don't know, water is liquid kind of on high level without going into chemistry. And it's not that we think about it every single day when we drink water, but like it's not that we actually forget it if somebody asks us, right? No matter how many news or papers, whatever we've read, or books, right? We still remember the basic facts. And I think what you just said with the Atlas model, right? So approach outsourcing that memory into some database that you can maybe even control and say, okay, these facts need to stay. I never want them to go away no matter what, right? These are like basic principles. And maybe they exist in every domain, like finance or healthcare and so on. And yeah, I think this is interesting direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And all these facts change, right? It can also be that over time you have to adjust facts or knowledge, and this is way easier, I think, if you have it explicitly somewhere in documents and not so much just in the parameters of the model.
Yeah, exactly. And like maybe just one example that comes to my mind is like cities change names, right? And so you could still go back and say, what was the name of that city between 1995 and 2000, right? Something like that.
Yeah, or presidents of nations also change, right? So for these kind of queries, I think you want to make sure that you're up to date and change it.
Yeah, and I think maybe coming back to search, understanding the context will play such a huge role once these models become even more mature and valuable and knowledge aware. But the challenge of extracting context from the query still is there. If I say, who is the president of the United States, it might conclude that I'm asking about now, present. But if I was a couple paragraphs above already setting the stage about specific period of time in the past, it could actually reason that I'm maybe not asking about presence, right?
Exactly. It could do this reasoning, or could you ask a clarifying question, right? Or say like, oh, like here are a couple of options. Did you mean this, like as you maybe would more do in a human conversation?
Yeah, so I think it's called conversational information retrieval, right? And
Yeah.
I think that we might start seeing this blend of what probably today is called a chatbot and a search engine, but it could be a search engine which is just clarifying.
Yeah, and I mean overall, I think that's I think also as a field, I think we are seeing that the search, or what we understand under search, is evolving, right? So it's not so much anymore. So think about web search engines. In few cases, you are still you search and you click on the website and then you search somewhere your information. But in many cases, it's really this kind of zero-click search now, where you have your query and within the search results, you already find what you want, right? And I think this is just getting more and more popular, that you're not providing say there's the route to go to another knowledge source, but you're trying to really answer the query directly, and there's no need to go further.
Yeah, I will also try to remember to link one paper. Maybe it's like a series of papers from Microsoft where they try to embed knowledge into the language model. And that's, I think it's a very interesting direction, as well as also embedding knowledge graphs into the model, right? Because one way, as you said, and I think that trend probably still there, that yeah, you can keep adding parameters, more and more, billions, trillions, but at some point it just simply becomes impractical, right? To have such a large model in production, and then how do you fine tune it? But again, it doesn't capture the relationships well enough, right? If you didn't explain it.
Absolutely. And just thinking of it, we have actually a meetup end of September. So if you are interested, or anyone here who's listening, where Niels Reimers will also give a talk about exactly that topic. How do you kind of incorporate knowledge into a language model? And that will be end of September. So if you just look for, maybe you can link it in the show notes. It's our Open NLP Meetup series.
Absolutely, we'll do that gladly. My favorite question. I know you touched many times as well during this podcast, which I really, really enjoyed. But what else drives you beyond, you have a role as a CTO, you have a role as a pioneer in this space, and maybe educating and reaching more and more people. Is there something else that drives you sort of beyond the tech itself in this field?
Yeah, like I mean, I think my excitement, my passion for NLP is clear. I hope that came through. But yeah, for me, like the technology is the one thing, but then really seeing how you solve problems with that, like how you can, I don't know, make annoying work of financial analyst faster and better. Like just seeing that either say firsthand because they're a customer, or let's say more indirectly. If you know that this is now kind of possible. So I think this is like still a big driver for me personally. And I think one thing that I absolutely love about open source, that it's not just paying users, commercial users, where you kind of see that, but we are really this huge community by now from Haystack, where there's so many different people with different backgrounds, different use cases, and it's for me often like just end of the day, really like scrolling through, I don't know, GitHub issues, kind of questions that come in, or on Slack, or now we're on Discord, like what people are actually building with that, and it's really cool to see what they kind of use case come up with, but also how far this actually got, that it's used in so many companies all around the world, from big tech to classical enterprise to startups who build their products on top. And I think this is like still one of my the biggest motivation boosters that you can get. Seeing the community appreciating, using it, and probably also like on, say, beyond GitHub. Just recently ran into a guy in a bar here in Berlin who used Haystack, and that's definitely something I never would have imagined a few years ago. This kind of happens. Or what we said, I think, last year, when we kind of defined a bit our like vision and thought about some goals at the company offsite. I think one was for the open source side, that people start putting, say, Haystack experience into their job requirements, or the other way around, people putting that in their CVs. And we thought, oh, like this is maybe 3 years down the road. But then a few weeks afterwards, we saw these first job postings where this was required, and also CVs where this was mentioned. So I think that's just cool to see how you can leave a footprint, and beyond, let's say, your immediate bubble, but really kind of spreads. It's open, it's all digital, it's kind of connected in the world, right? and leaving this kind of footprint is really what I enjoy. And yeah, I mean, search I think as a domain is just for me really interesting because it's so diverse, right? So you can go in many directions, can dive very deep into NLP, can think a lot about the user side at the end for what use cases you can make it work. Can think a lot about scalability. It's just, I think, one of the most, from my point, most exciting and diverse applications of technology right now, and one where I think you can really relate to, like where you can sort of think, okay, what is actually possible, what kind of information you can make accessible, and that's really the beauty of it.
Yeah, it's beautifully put. Thanks for sharing. I know some of the guests that I asked this question would probably think, hey, why is this philosophical question? I'm just, doing it. I like it. That's it. but I think it gives so much towards you reflecting on what you do, because that might also influence your choices in the tech or in how you approach your users, what message you send, and so on and so forth, and maybe reconsider some things as well. And the open source part, you reminded me of one story when it was my first time visiting the US. I think it was 2015, and it was ApacheCon. I was crossing on the traffic light, on the pedestrian crossing, and it was like this narrow avenue, not narrow, wide avenue, right? And it's like takes on my account like few minutes, but it's of course not minutes, maybe 20 seconds. And somebody bumps into me from the other side of the road saying, I know you. I was like, no, it's impossible. It's my first time visit. I'm not a public figure. How is it possible? And he said, because you built Luke, it's one of the open source kind of Lucene index readers that I used to work on, which I inherited from its original creator, Andrei Beletsky. And that's it. He didn't stop to say anything else, but he made my day, and I think what you felt in the bar was probably similar, knowing that that person uses Haystack, and it's amazing.
Absolutely, yeah, because it feels very honest, right? It feels like, okay, this is not because we, I don't know, had crazy marketing or anything like that. It's just like really like a natural community thing, and just building something that's useful for others.
Yeah, exactly, which probably reinforces you and gives you this, well, in this case, direct feedback. Well, not on the specifics of your platform, but actually the fact that they're using it and relying on it and building a business, and that tells that to the decisions you made in the architecture and so on and so forth. That's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, like from a company perspective, that's one of the fastest feedback cycles you can have, right? And like just seeing diverse use cases, diverse developer personas, how they approach things, what they are struggling with. So also from that angle, I think it was fast.
Yeah,
absolutely crucial.
I think it's the best, and it's like, I think it's Elon Musk who said the best setting is when your user fell in love with your product and wants you to succeed. So yeah, there you go. Amazing. And I've enjoyed this podcast so much. Is there anything you want to announce to our listeners?
Maybe just the meetup I already mentioned. So if you're interested in NLP, that's happening in September. It will be hybrid, so you can join online. But if you happen to be in Berlin, we also have a small on-site event. And then of course, if you haven't tried Haystack yet, maybe check it out on GitHub. I would promise, you can get an easy first pipeline up and running, and just give it a try. Maybe try question answering if you haven't, if you're more coming from traditional search. On Deepset Cloud, as mentioned, we just released a big new model on experiments. We're still in an early stage with the product, but we have an early access program. So if you're interested, if you have an NLP use case that you want to bring to production in a fast way, where you think about how to scale it, how to actually find that pipeline, how to collaborate with your end users, get some feedback there, just reach out to us, and then we can get you on the early access program.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Malte. I've enjoyed again saying this, and this was deep and thoughtful. And we will make sure to link all the goodies that you mentioned in the show notes. And I hope to meet someday, maybe in Berlin, maybe somewhere else. But
absolutely, yeah. Let's make that happen. And yeah, I totally enjoyed our conversation as well. So yeah, thanks a lot for having me. Was definitely interesting.
Fantastic. All the best with Haystack and with your research and development.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Malte. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.